The colonel entered the administrative wing with the same brisk stride that carried him across battlefields and briefing rooms alike. His boots struck the polished floor with sharp precision, echoing down the hallway, announcing his presence. Before he even reached the rows of desks, clerks looked up, some stiffening nervously, others pretending to be absorbed in their papers. He was a man who carried authority, not only in his rank insignia, but in the way his presence filled the air, like a thundercloud before a storm. A woman in the far corner did not look up. She sat behind a desk stacked with files taller than her shoulders, her posture neat but unremarkable, her movements mechanical. Her glasses slid halfway down the bridge of her nose, catching the light of the hanging bulbs, and her thin fingers tapped steadily on the typewriter keys. The colonel's sharp eyes swept past her without pause, barely acknowledging her existence. To him, she was just another anonymous clerk in an army of thousands, a face without a story, a cog in the grinding machinery of war. He had seen her before, always in the background. She was there at morning roll calls, quietly handing out documents. She was in the briefing rooms, slipping papers onto tables before fading into the corner like a shadow. If anyone had asked him to describe her, he would have struggled. Small, he might have said. Bookish. Fragile, perhaps. The kind of soldier who would never survive outside the safety of office walls. His business that day was simple. Personnel. Reassignment reviews. Stacks of files had piled up, and his task was to approve or reject transfers. He despised this kind of work. Paperwork felt pointless, especially to a man who believed war was fought with steel and fire, not ink and carbon. Copies. But orders were orders. He moved toward her desk, because hers was the only one not cluttered by nervous chatter. She barely raised her eyes when he stopped before her, offering only the smallest of nods. "Colonel," she murmured politely, her voice steady but quiet, like the sound of a page turning in a book. "Files," he said gruffly, tapping the stack with his gloved finger. She slid one toward him without breaking rhythm on her typewriter. The colonel grabbed it and stepped aside, eager to get the tedious job over with. The first few files were routine supply clerks requesting transfers to depots closer to home, medics reassigned to field hospitals, drivers rotated between convoys. His eyes skinned each page with the speed of long practice, signing his initials. Where required, stamping approvals with the heavy clunk of authority. Then he reached hers. At first, he didn't notice her name. He only noticed the odd red strip across the top of the file, the word classified stamped heavily in black ink. He frowned. Classified files rarely crossed his desk in the admin wing. Curious, he opened it. The first page caught him off guard. Sniper Unit Eastern Front Deployment. Commendation. Distinguished Marksmanship Medal. Confirmed kills. 37. His brows knit together. That couldn't be right. He turned the page, expecting some clerical error, maybe a misfiled document belonging to another soldier. But the second page detailed an operation, an ambush broken by a single sharpshooter, lives saved by precise fire. The after-action report bore her name at the top, her signature at the bottom. He blinked, glancing up at her across the room. She hadn't moved, still typing steadily, the same quiet clerk she had been 5 minutes ago. Could this be the same woman? He flipped another page. Confirmed kills. 52. Code name. The Ghost. The colonel felt a small chill run up his spine. He had heard whispers of the Ghost during his campaigns, a sniper whose presence on the battlefield was never seen, only felt in the sharp crack of a rifle and the sudden collapse of an enemy officer. Soldiers spoke of the Ghost in hushed tones, half in awe, half in fear. Many dismissed it as a myth, a story to keep morale alive in the mud and blood. Yet here it was, in black and white, tied to the unremarkable woman typing quietly 20 feet away. He turned another page. Confirmed kills. 87. Enemy commander eliminated. Sector Delta. His throat tightened. He flipped again. Confirmed kills. 101. High-value target neutralized. Operation Nightfall. Finally, near the bottom of the file, his eyes widened as he read. The line that made his stomach clench. Confirmed kills. 121. For a moment, he could hear nothing but the rush of blood in his ears. 121. That wasn't the record of a soldier. It was the record of a weapon, a force of nature. And yet the weapon was disguised as a quiet woman in glasses, hidden behind stacks of paperwork, living in silence as though her past did not exist. The colonel leaned back in his chair, trying to reconcile the two images in his head, the legendary sniper, who had shifted the tide of battles, and the soft-spoken clerk, whose hands now pressed keys instead of triggers. It seemed impossible. His eyes lingered on her longer this time. She didn't look up, though perhaps she felt his gaze. Her face betrayed nothing. Calm, collected, unreadable. There was no sign of the woman described in the file, the one who had lain in mud for days waiting for a perfect shot, the one who had pulled the trigger more than 100 times, each squeeze ending a life. And yet, there she was. The colonel suddenly realized he had been staring. Clearing his throat, he snapped the file shut and shuffled the papers back into order. He didn't call her name. He didn't question her. Something inside him warned against it. If the file was true, and every fiber of him now believed it was, then she had chosen to bury her past beneath layers of silence. Still, his curiosity itched. Why was she here? Why had someone with such a deadly record retreated into anonymity, content to shuffle papers while the war still raged outside? Was it exhaustion? Trauma? Or perhaps something deeper, a choice to vanish, to fade away from the battlefield and erase herself from history? As he wrestled with the thought, a memory surfaced, soldiers whispering around a campfire years ago. The ghost isn't a man, one had said. She's a woman. Small, quiet, but deadlier than anyone you'll ever meet. The colonel had laughed then, dismissing it as a soldier's tale. Now, staring at the clerk across the room, he wondered how many other jokes had been truths hidden in plain sight. A sound of her typewriter filled the silence between them, steady, unbroken, like the heartbeat of a machine. Each click of the keys was a reminder. She was still here, still working, but worlds away from the battlefield described in her file. The colonel closed the folder with deliberate care, almost reverently. This was no ordinary record. This was a story locked in shadows, a history the world would never believe unless it was written in ink and blood. He placed the file back on the stack, his expression unreadable, but his mind alive with questions. For the first time in years, paperwork had left him shaken. And for the first time, he looked at a clerk and saw not a fragile shadow, but a legend hidden in silence. The colonel had seen countless personnel files in his career, but this one refused to let him go. Even after he shut the folder, the words stamped across those pages burned in his thoughts. Confirmed kills. 121. He told himself to move on. 2. Continue with the tedious stack of transfer requests waiting on his desk. But his hand hovered over her file again. He had learned long ago that when something gnawed at him like this, it was because there was more to uncover. And so, with a quiet exhale, he opened the folder once more. The first section was standard. Date of enlistment, rank progression. Physical evaluations. Nothing remarkable. In fact, the early notes described her as unsuitable for field duty, citing her slight frame and reserved temperament. He smirked. Those words seemed laughably out of place now. If anything, they proved how blind the system had been. But the further he read, the stranger it became. Buried among the administrative notes were coded orders, stamped with restricted clearances. They outlined missions she had been attached to, operations he recognized from years past. Some of these had been turning points, missions whispered about in military corridors, the kind of battles no one wanted to officially document because they had teetered too close to failure. And in every one of those missions, her name appeared. In the margins, not in bold, not even highlighted, just quietly written, often under a call sign, the Ghost. The colonel felt his chest tighten as memory stirred. He recalled one particular night, a grim stalemate on the eastern ridge. His unit had been pinned down by a sniper they never saw, losing men one by one. Then suddenly, the fire had stopped. Scouts returned at dawn with stories of an enemy marksman killed cleanly through the scope, an impossible shot made in near darkness. No one had claimed credit. Some said divine luck had saved them. But here, in this file, he found the after-action. Note: confirmed kill by operative number 473. The Ghost. Her. He rubbed his jaw, leaning back in his chair. He had been there that night, cursing his luck, certain he would never see daylight. And all along, the quiet clerk, now tapping away at her typewriter across the room, had been the one to pull the trigger that spared him. He turned another page. The handwriting changed from neat typewritten reports to hurried scribbles, field notes hastily logged by commanding officers. They painted a picture not of glory, but of necessity. Operative provided overwatch during retreat. Eliminated pursuing. Squad, unit survived only due to her intervention. Another note: enemy commander neutralized at 600 yards. Operation saved, and then one that gave him pause. Request immediate reassignment of operative. Psychological strain evident. Shows reluctance to continue. The colonel stared at those words. For the first time, the legend of the Ghost cracked to reveal the human beneath. She had carried her rifle with the precision of a machine, but the toll had been real. He could imagine it now, the silence after each shot, the long hours waiting in the mud, the weight of faces that never left her, even as she tried to sleep. He glanced up at her again. Still at her desk, still typing. Her face was calm, but he wondered what it concealed. Did she ever think of those nights, those missions? Or had she locked them away so tightly that even she pretended they didn't exist? He returned to the file. Tucked inside was a faded photograph, nearly lost among the paperwork. It showed a squad of soldiers, their uniforms muddied, faces streaked with exhaustion. In the corner, almost cropped out of the frame, stood a small figure clutching a rifle nearly as tall as she was. Her eyes in the photo were sharp, focused, not the quiet ones he saw now behind wire-rimmed glasses. He studied it for a long moment, trying to reconcile the two images of the same woman. He flipped the page, and another detail struck him. The Ghost had never officially been promoted, despite her record. Each recommendation for recognition medals, citations, even simple commendations had been crossed out, stamped denied. Someone somewhere had deliberately buried her achievements under layers of bureaucracy. The colonel's frown deepened. Was it to protect her? Or to protect the military from admitting they had overlooked her until necessity forced their hand? The more he read, the more it unsettled him. There was power in this kind of silence. A story like hers could inspire, but it could also embarrass. Men who had been decorated for far less had their faces on posters and their names in history books. Meanwhile, she had been erased, hidden in plain sight as a clerk. He tapped the file with his finger, fighting the urge to call her over, to demand answers. But he knew better. Soldiers like her didn't volunteer stories. They didn't seek recognition. If she had wanted the world to know, the world would have already known. Instead, she had chosen this life of anonymity, filing away not only reports, but her own past. Still, the colonel couldn't stop reading. Each page drew him deeper, each report another layer of a legend he had once dismissed. It wasn't the sheer number of confirmed kills that haunted him. It was the quiet consistency. No glory, no fanfare, just precision and silence. One life ended, another saved, again and again, until the total reached 121. At last, he reached the final section, her reassignment request. The language was formal, but between the lines he read the exhaustion. Request. Permanent placement in administrative support. Decline further field deployment. And beneath it, the commanding officer's note. Approved. Soldier has done enough. The colonel closed the file, his hand heavy. Done enough. The words lingered. What did it mean to have done enough, when your file listed more confirmed kills than most snipers would dream of? What did it mean to have carried a war in your scope, only to choose a desk as your refuge? He set the folder down slowly, his thoughts tangled. For years, he had believed heroes were loud, obvious, their names shouted across parades. But now, staring across the room at the quiet woman who had returned to her typewriter without a second thought, he wondered if true heroism was something else entirely, something quieter, heavier, and lonelier. She paused briefly in her typing, adjusting her glasses. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. Hers were calm, steady, unreadable. Then she returned to her work, as if nothing had passed between them. The colonel looked down at the file again. His decision made, he would not speak of what he had read. Some stories weren't meant for medals or speeches. Some stories lived only in the silence between typed words and sealed folders. But from that day on, when he saw her at her desk, he no longer saw a clerk. He saw the ghost. Long before she was known as the ghost, before her name appeared in classified files and whispered rumors, she had been just a girl from a forgotten corner of the countryside. Her story began on a weather-beaten farm tucked between dense pine, forests and rolling hills. The land was stubborn, refusing to yield crops without a fight, and so was the girl who grew up on it. She was small, wiry, and quiet traits that often led outsiders to underestimate her. But those who knew her family understood that silence on their farm wasn't weakness. It was survival. Her father was a veteran of an older war, a man who carried scars both visible and hidden. He didn't talk much about the battles he had seen, but he believed in preparation. When his daughter was barely tall enough to lift a rifle, he taught her how to hold it steady, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger, how to listen to the wind in the trees to gauge the path of a bullet. At first, she shot tin cans balanced on fence posts. Then she graduated to clay bottles lined along the rail. Eventually, her father led her into the forest, where game moved silently between the shadows. She learned patience their hours of stillness, eyes scanning, body unmoving, until the perfect moment came. Her father never praised her with many words, but when she hit her mark, he gave a single nod, and that was enough. The farm hardened. Her winters were brutal, summers sweltering. Work began before dawn, and ended long after the sun dipped below the tree line. She milked cows, mended fences, chopped wood, and tilled the stubborn earth alongside her family. There was no room for fragility, no space for indulgence. Every task was survival, every day a test. And through it all, her rifle remained by her side, a tool for hunting, for protection, for life itself. By the time she was 16, her aim was sharper than most men twice her age. Neighbors came to her father, asking if she could track game for their families. Some even whispered she was blessed with hunter's eyes. She didn't think of it as a gift. It was simply life waiting, watching, acting with precision when the moment demanded. When war broke out, the world beyond. The forest seemed to tilt overnight. Posters appeared in town, calling on citizens to serve their country. Young men enlisted eagerly, chasing glory, adventure, or simply paychecks. For her, it wasn't excitement that drove her. It was duty and perhaps, in some quiet part of her heart, a hunger to prove that she was more than a farmer's daughter with calloused hands. She went to the recruitment office with determination, her rifle skills polished, her confidence steady. But the moment the officer behind the desk looked at her small frame, his expression faltered. "You'd do better with a typewriter than a rifle," he said, shuffling her papers with disinterest. She protested. She spoke of years in the forest, of tracking deer through snowstorms, of striking bottles from fences at impossible distances. But her words fell flat. The army wasn't ready to see her as a soldier. To them, she was a girl, and girls belonged behind desks. So they handed her a uniform and sent her to clerical training. For weeks, she filed papers, learned to type faster, memorized codes and protocols. Her superiors praised her neatness, her discipline, her ability to remain focused for hours. None of them noticed the way her eyes lingered on the rifles carried by the men in training yards. None of them knew she had to fight the urge every day to correct their stances, to show them how to steady their breathing before a shot. She didn't. Complaining was wasted breath. Instead, she worked silently, blending into the background as she always had. But deep down, the same patience that had guided her hunts in the forest guided her now. She waited. Her chance came sooner than anyone expected. During her first deployment, she was sent near the front lines not as a soldier, but as a clerk responsible for records, dispatches, and correspondence. She wore glasses to read reports late into the night, ink staining her fingers. She kept her head down, listening to soldiers swap stories about skirmishes and ambushes. Sometimes she heard whispers about snipers, those invisible hunters who could shift the tide of battle with a single shot. She listened quietly, storing every detail, every scrap of information. Then came the ambush. It was supposed to be a routine transfer of supplies. She rode in the back of a truck with crates of ammunition, her typewriter strapped to her lap. The convoy moved through a narrow pass when the first shots rang out. Chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled for cover, some firing blindly into the trees. Men fell. Shouts filled the air. She didn't panic. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Stillness is survival. Breathe. Wait. Crawling across the dirt, she reached for a fallen soldier's rifle. It felt natural in her hands, heavy but familiar, like coming home after a long absence. She pressed her cheek against the stock, her eyes narrowing as she searched the ridgeline. There, the glint of a scope. She didn't hesitate. One breath, one squeeze of the trigger, and the shot rang out. A figure collapsed in the distance. Another scope appeared. Another shot followed. One after another, the hidden enemies dropped before they even realized where death had come from. When the firing ceased, silence stretched over the battlefield. Her unit stared at her, stunned. She lowered the rifle calmly, dusted dirt from her uniform, and said nothing. Reports later described her as unervingly composed, calm under fire to an unnatural degree. The official record logged her first confirmed kills. Her superiors, who had once dismissed her as little more than a clerk, began to look at her differently. Word spread quietly, cautiously. Some said she was lucky. Others insisted it was impossible for a desk girl to shoot like that. But those who had been there, those whose lives she had saved, never doubted. They had seen the patience in her eyes, the precision in her aim. And so, the farmer's daughter who had been reduced to clerical duty began to walk two paths. By day, she typed reports, stamped files, shuffled papers. By night, or whenever the battlefield called, she became something else entirely. Her story was no longer confined to farm fences and forest hunts. She was no longer just a farmer's daughter. She was becoming a soldier, one whose silence and precision would soon make her a legend. The first ambush had not been her last. In the weeks that followed, whispers of the clerk who could shoot rippled quietly through her unit. Most dismissed it as exaggeration. War stories had a way of inflating until reality was buried beneath bravado. But for the men who had been there, the memory lingered. They had watched her pick up a rifle with the calm certainty of someone who had been waiting her whole life for that exact moment. She hadn't spoken of it since. When asked, she shrugged, saying only, "I did what I had to do." Then she returned to her typewriter, fingers tapping away at keys as though nothing had changed. But something had. Her name began appearing in assignments she had not volunteered for. She was ordered to accompany supply runs, to sit in on patrols. For clerical observation, the report said, but she understood. They wanted her close in case the shooting started again. She didn't resist. She went where she was told, carrying her typewriter in its case, like any clerk would. But beneath the typewriter, nestled in its compartment, lay a rifle, carefully broken down into parts. She kept it hidden from curious eyes, yet ready to assemble in minutes. The second time it happened, it was raining. Her convoy had stalled in the mud, trucks spinning helplessly in deep ruts. The men grumbled, cursing the weather, struggling to push vehicles free. She stood quietly to the side, scanning the tree line without knowing why. The forest seemed too still. Then came the first crack of gunfire. A soldier beside her collapsed before he even knew he'd been hit. Panic rippled through the unit, men scrambling for cover as bullets tore through canvas and splintered wood. Shouts filled the air. "Sniper! Sniper in the trees!" She dropped the typewriter case in the mud and pulled the rifle pieces free. Her hands moved without hesitation, assembling the weapon with practiced efficiency. The stock locked into place, the scope clicked onto its mount, the bolt slid smoothly forward. She lay flat in the muck, ignoring the rain soaking her uniform. Through the scope, the world sharpened. She saw the glint of a muzzle between branches, a faint shift of movement. She waited, steadying her breath, timing her shot with the rhythm of her heartbeat. One squeeze of the trigger, and the muzzle flash vanished into silence. But she didn't lower the rifle. She scanned again, patient, knowing one sniper rarely worked alone. Minutes dragged. Rain pounded the earth. Then another flicker, a reflection of glass. Another shot. Another body dropped. When it was over, the forest was quiet again. Her unit stared at her, mud dripping from her face, rifle steady in her hands. She met their eyes briefly, then lowered the weapon and began disassembling it as calmly as she had built it. She returned it to the case, wiped her hands on her trousers, and picked up her typewriter. No words were exchanged. None were needed. From then on, no one questioned why the clerk was always present on dangerous routes. No one laughed at the sight of her carrying a battered case. They didn't call her a sniper yet, not openly, but they no longer called her just a clerk either. Each time an ambush came, she was there. Each time the rifle spoke, men survived who would have otherwise been buried. Her first true mission came quietly. One evening, she was summoned to a tent where officers hunched over maps under dim lantern light. She stood at attention, unsure why she had been called. The commanding officer, a grizzled man with years of war etched into his face, looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "We've got a problem," he said, tapping the map. "Enemy machine gun nest here. They've pinned us for days. Every attempt to advance ends with casualties. We need someone who can take them out from a distance." The officer shifted uncomfortably. Then, almost reluctantly, the commander's eyes settled on her. "You've got steady hands," he said. "Think you can do it?" She hesitated only briefly. Then she nodded. That night, she crawled through mud and shadows toward the ridge overlooking the nest. Every inch was deliberate, every movement measured. She blended with the earth, becoming part of the silence. When she reached position, she set her rifle on its bipod and adjusted the scope. Below, the enemy soldiers laughed around a fire, confident in their stronghold. She exhaled slowly, crosshairs aligning with the first gunner's chest. The rifle cracked, and the man slumped silently. Before the others realized, she had already shifted, firing again and again. Chaos erupted in the nest as survivors scattered. But each one fell before they could escape. When the smoke cleared, the machine gun nest was silent. Her unit advanced the next day without resistance. No one spoke of her role, but every man who marched past the abandoned nest knew who had made it possible. From that night on, she was no longer brought along as insurance. She was deployed deliberately, her assignments written in coded language, but always clear in intent. Eliminate threats, unseen and unheard. Her legend grew, though she never sought it. Soldiers who had never met her spoke of a ghost who appeared in the mud and rain, striking with impossible accuracy. Some said she never missed. Others claimed she could see in the dark. She let the stories swirl. The truth was simpler. She was patient. She was steady. She was what the battlefield had demanded her to become. And with each mission, she felt something shift within her. The farm girl who once shot bottles on a fence had disappeared. The clerk who typed quietly in the corner was fading. In her place stood a soldier who understood death not as an abstract number in a file, but as a decision made in silence, one trigger pull at a time. By the time her file recorded her 25th confirmed kill, she knew the transformation was complete. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't waiting for permission. The battlefield had awakened what had always been inside her. She was the ghost.v. The machine gun nest was only the beginning. After that night, her place in the war changed permanently. She no longer marched with the supply convoys or sat in the back of trucks carrying crates of ammunition. Instead, she was called into tents, under cover of darkness, summoned quietly by officers who didn't announce her name in front of others. Orders were whispered, assignments slipped into her hand on folded scraps of paper, and then she was gone, disappearing into the field, where only the rifle spoke for her. Officially, she remained a clerk. Her personnel file listed her as administrative support, responsible for records and communications. On paper, she had no combat history, no kills, no missions. But in reality, she was placed in the shadows, working where recognition never followed. The first of these missions tested her resolve. She was tasked with eliminating a pair of enemy observers who had been calling artillery strikes with brutal precision. Each day, their radio transmissions rained fire down on her unit's positions, killing men by the dozen. Scouts tried to locate them, but the observers moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be cornered. She tracked them for 3 days, alone, carrying only her rifle, rations, and the patience drilled into her by years of hunting deer in the forest. She crawled through mud and lay motionless in tall grass until her skin burned with insect bites. She learned to watch without blinking, to sleep in minutes, to eat without shifting position. On the 4th morning, she saw them, 2 silhouettes crouched on a ridge, scanning the valley with binoculars. Her scope locked onto the first man. She exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger, and the figure crumpled. Before the second realized what had happened, she shifted aim and fired again. Silence reclaimed the ridge. When she returned to camp that night, no one greeted her. Only her commanding officer gave a brief nod, marking her mission as success. In a ledger, there were no medals, no celebrations, Just another assignment completed. But the men in the trenches began to notice. They never saw her leave, but they felt her presence when the battlefield suddenly tilted in their favor. A sniper pinning them down would fall silent after a single shot rang out in the distance. Enemy officers collapsed mid-command, their troops scattering in confusion. Soldiers began to murmur, "The ghost is with us." At first, she hated the name. It made her sound like something unreal, a myth instead of a woman with calloused hands and sleepless eyes. But as missions stacked up, the name clung to her whether she wanted it or not. Soldiers clung to the legend because it gave them comfort. If the ghost was near, they believed death was hunting the enemy, not them. Her kills climbed steadily, 20, then 30, then 50. Each was recorded only in the hidden section of her file, never spoken aloud. She felt no pride in the growing number. Each shot was necessary, each life taken so that others could live, but the weight of them pressed on her shoulders all the same. One mission remained etched in her memory more than most. She had been sent to cover a retreat. The unit was badly outnumbered, forced to fall back across open ground. Without protection, they would be slaughtered. She positioned herself on a hill overlooking the field, her rifle steady on its bipod. As the soldiers sprinted across the plain, enemy fire rained down. She worked methodically, her scope sweeping, her fingers squeezing the trigger in rhythm. With her breath, one shot dropped a machine gunner. Another silenced an officer raising his pistol. One after another, she thinned the enemy line, buying precious seconds for her comrades to escape. By the time the last soldier reached safety, her shoulder ached from recoil, and her eyes stung from staring through the scope for so long. She had fired 21 rounds. 19 had found their mark. When she returned to camp, mud-caked and hollow-eyed, no one celebrated. The survivors were too exhausted, too shaken. But she saw the way they looked at her, something between awe and fear. They didn't thank her. They didn't need to. Their survival was thanks enough. Her reputation grew in silence. Whispers spread across units she had never met. Some soldiers claimed she could see in the dark. Others swore she had survived bullets passing inches from her head. A few believed she wasn't human at all, but a spirit sent to haunt the battlefield. She let the rumors swirl. Myths were easier than truth. Myths didn't reveal the long nights of waiting, the gnawing loneliness of missions where she lay buried in the earth, praying not to be discovered. The higher her kill count climbed, the deeper she was buried in secrecy. Command ordered her missions classified at the highest level. Her name was never attached, only her call sign, the Ghost. Even fellow officers were given no details. To most, she was still a clerk with glasses, shuffling papers, her rifle hidden in plain sight. Yet inside, she felt the transformation. She was no longer the girl on the farm, nor the clerk tapping quietly on a typewriter. The battlefield had molded her into something else, something the army didn't know how to categorize. A weapon, yes, but a weapon with a heartbeat, a weapon that carried scars unseen by those who relied on her. One night, sitting alone in her tent after a mission, she removed her rifle's scope and held it in her hands. The glass reflected the lantern light, but in her mind, it reflected something else. The faces of those she had seen through it. Some were fleeting, shadows gone, in an instant. Others lingered, haunting her with eyes that stared back even in death. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath, and reminded herself of the truth. Each shot had saved lives. Each kill meant comrades survived to fight another day. But no matter how she rationalized it, the number in her file grew relentlessly, carving itself into her soul. By the time the tally reached 75, she knew there was no going back. She could type reports until her fingers ached, hide behind stacks of papers as though she were ordinary, but the battlefield had branded her She was the ghost now, whether she embraced it or not. And the war was far from over. The number was never written in ink where anyone could see it. It was tucked away in a hidden file, a folder thick with typed reports, stamped classified. Each mission carefully logged, each kill confirmed with detached military precision. Sniper elimination successful. Target neutralized. 71 confirmed. 83 confirmed. 98 confirmed. But for her, the numbers were not tidy lines on a page. They lived in her mind, etched deep, impossible to erase. She remembered the breath before each shot, the stillness of the trigger squeeze, the flicker of movement as a life ended. They came to her at night, unbidden, the way some people recited prayers. 121. The file said it was her achievement. To her, it was her burden. At first, she had pushed the weight aside. Each mission was survival, each shot necessary. The faces of her comrades reminded her of that truth. She had seen men live because she had acted. She had saved convoys, stopped ambushes, silenced enemy. Fire before it swallowed her unit whole. That knowledge had given her the strength to keep going. But as the number climbed past 100, the balance began to shift. She no longer remembered just the missions she had completed. She began remembering the eyes. One pair in particular haunted her. It was a young soldier, barely more than a boy, manning a machine gun in a shallow trench. She had tracked him for hours, waiting for her moment, lying still as ants crawled across her skin. When the time came, she had aimed at his chest and squeezed the trigger. He had turned his head at the last second, as though sensing something, and her crosshairs caught. His gaze. She never forgot the shock in those eyes, the brief human recognition before the bullet struck. Afterward, when the battlefield was silent again, she lay in the mud for hours, unable to move. She told herself it was just one more necessary kill, one more life taken to save others. But she couldn't silence the memory of those eyes. The ghost was supposed to be a legend. Legends didn't remember faces. Legends didn't feel the sting of guilt in the quiet hours before dawn. Yet she did. The army, of course, saw none of this. To them, she was indispensable. Missions that once seemed impossible now had a solution. Send the ghost. Entire advances were planned around her silent rifle. Soldiers whispered her name like a prayer before battle, believing her presence meant survival. But the more they revered her, the more isolated she felt. They no longer looked at her as a clerk, a comrade, even a woman. They looked at her as something else entirely. A weapon wrapped in human form. Some men avoided her eyes, as though afraid she might see too much. Others treated her with reverence, as though she carried divine favor. But no one spoke to her as one of their own. In the mess tent, she often sat alone, her tray untouched. The laughter and chatter of soldiers felt distant, a language she no longer spoke. When conversations reached her, they often stopped abruptly, replaced by awkward silence. She had become untouchable, not because she demanded it, but because the myth of the ghost had consumed her. There were moments when she longed to break the illusion, to slam her tray down, to remind them she bled, she ached, she feared just as they did, but she never did. The army needed the ghost, and so the ghost she remained. The toll grew heavier with each mission. Sleep came rarely, broken by sudden jolts awake, her hands twitching as though gripping the rifle even in dreams. She began to dread the silence of night, when her mind replayed every shot in perfect clarity. Her commanding officer noticed her fatigue once. "You're running thin," he said quietly, his voice rough with concern. She forced a smile. "I can handle it, sir." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, as though seeing the cracks beneath the surface. Still, the orders kept coming. The war didn't pause for broken souls. And so she carried on. Mission after mission, the file grew thicker. 105, 112, 121. The number rose, and with it, the silence around her deepened. Sometimes, in the rare moments of solitude, she found herself writing letters she would never send. Letters to her family back home, telling them about the girl she had once been, the one who read books by lantern light, who laughed at silly jokes, who dreamed of a quiet life after the war. She wrote about the farm, about the way the sun hit, the fields at dawn, about the smell of earth after rain. She wrote these things as though reminding herself that world had once existed, even if it felt impossibly far away now. When the letters were finished, she burned them. She couldn't let them be found. The ghost wasn't supposed to have such thoughts. The ghost wasn't supposed to be human. One night, after a mission that had left her lying in the mud for 2 days, she returned to camp and found a small note tucked under her typewriter. It was written in a soldier's hurried scrawl. "We lived because of you. Thank you." She stared at it for a long time, her throat tight, before folding it carefully and placing it in her breast pocket. Unlike the numbers in her file, she carried that note with her always. A small reminder that the burden had meaning. But the note didn't erase the weight. The file kept growing. The myth kept spreading. The ghost was unstoppable, unshakable, inhuman. Only she knew the truth, that the ghost was a mask, and behind it was a woman fraying at the edges, haunted by every life she had taken. And yet, when the orders came, she picked up the rifle again, because she knew one thing with certainty. The war wasn't done with her yet, and neither was her file. The colonel had seen many things during his decades in uniform. Battles lost and won, medals awarded and denied, heroes praised and forgotten. But nothing had prepared him for the day he opened her file and found the truth. It had been a routine. Review, administrative orders, personnel transfers, promotions. He was halfway through the stack when the folder marked Classified Personnel Operative caught his eye. Something about it made him pause. He slid it toward him, the paper trembling slightly under his fingers, though he wasn't sure if it was nerves or the weight of anticipation. The first page made him frown. Confirmed kills. 121, he blinked. Then reread the line. 121 confirmed kills. His mind recoiled. He knew the reports were accurate. The dossiers were cross-checked. Names, operations, after-action reports, all meticulously filed and authenticated. And she was sitting across from him, at the desk he had previously dismissed, typing quietly, her glasses perched low on her nose. The clerk, the invisible cog. The woman he had assumed was harmless, ordinary, someone safe. He looked again at the file. Page after page told the story. Sniper missions, ambushes prevented, enemy commanders neutralized, convoys saved. Each report meticulously recorded, yet none bore her name in official recognition. The army had hidden her behind bureaucracy, her actions classified, her achievements erased from public record. He felt the weight of it. Not all alone, though there was that. Not pride, though he felt it creep into his chest. Something heavier. Reverence. Fear. Responsibility. The colonel leaned back, rubbing his jaw. He thought of every time he had passed her desk, barely noticing her presence. Every morning she had greeted him politely, every report typed neatly, every stamp pressed with quiet precision. He had assumed she was nothing more than a clerk, and now he knew how wrong he had been. He remembered the soldier's whispers. The ghost. Tales of a sniper no one had ever seen, operating in silence, striking down the enemy with lethal precision. He had dismissed the stories as legend, a ghost story for war-weary troops. But the file confirmed it. The ghost was real, and the ghost was her. He glanced at her across the room. She did not look like a sniper. She did not look like someone who had survived countless ambush, who had pulled the trigger over 100 times, who had carried the lives of dozens of soldiers on her shoulders. She looked ordinary, small, quiet, absorbed in her work. A woman who could be invisible in a room of thousands. He realized then that part of her power lay in that very invisibility. The army had overlooked her once, underestimating her because she did not fit the stereotype of a soldier. And yet, when the battlefield demanded it, she had risen, weapon in hand, silent and unstoppable. The colonel closed the folder for a moment, his hands trembling slightly, and looked back at her. She did not acknowledge him. She had not stopped typing. She had not even glanced up. He understood something essential. This woman was not seeking recognition. Her anonymity was deliberate. She did not want fame. She did not want medals. She did not want to be a hero. She simply did what had to be done. And then she returned to her desk, to the quiet, ordinary life she had chosen as a refuge from the violence she had mastered. He opened the file again, reading more closely. There were after-action reports, some praising her skill in coded language, others noting her composure under extreme pressure. One report mentioned her psychological state, noting that despite her efficiency, she bore a toll that could not be ignored. She had requested reassignment, choosing the clerical role, yet continued to serve in secret when necessary. The colonel understood, in a way he had never understood anyone before, the duality of her existence. She was a ghost on the battlefield, and yet a clerk in the office. She had taken lives to save others. She had carried burdens that few could imagine, and she did all of it in silence. He remembered his own experiences in war. He had led men into ambushes, made decisions that resulted in death, carried orders that cost lives. Yet he had never done so with the precision, patience, and composure that she had demonstrated. She had faced danger not as part of a unit, but alone, relying on skill, instinct, and an unbreakable will. He closed the folder again, this time, slowly, reverently. He felt a surge of respect, mingled with a strange, unsettling admiration. And then something else, a twinge of guilt. He had overlooked her for years. He had assumed she was ordinary, harmless, someone safe. How many times had that assumption nearly cost lives? How many times had the army underestimated her, leaving missions to chance, when she could have made the difference? He looked across the office at her once more. She did not look up. She did not notice him. And perhaps that was best. Perhaps her power lay in being unseen. For the first time, the colonel realized that heroism did not always arrive in medals or parades. Sometimes heroism walked quietly among papers and typewriters, unremarkable to those who judged by appearances, invisible until the moment it was desperately needed. He thought about the 121 confirmed kills. He thought about the men and women saved because of her skill. He thought about the silent hours, the long nights spent lying in mud, the fear and solitude she must have endured. And he understood. This woman had carried more of the war than anyone else he had known. Yet she did so without complaint, without recognition, without reward. He felt a deep, almost protective respect for her. He would never reveal the full contents of her file. Some truths were too powerful, too dangerous for casual knowledge. She deserved her anonymity. Her story belonged to her alone. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, and thought, the ghost was real. The clerk was a legend. And she had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The colonel opened his eyes and looked at her one last time. She was still typing, still calm, still ordinary to everyone who did not know the truth. But he would never see her the same way again. The weight of her story settled on him, as heavy as the rifle she had carried silently across countless battlefields. He realized that the file was not just a record, It was a testament. A testament to skill, to survival, to courage, to the quiet heroism that rarely found recognition. The colonel's final thought as he stood from his chair was simple. He would protect her secret. He would ensure that her file remained hidden from those who would misuse it. And he would remember the lesson she had taught him without ever saying a word. Appearances could be deceiving, and true strength often walked quietly, invisible until the moment it mattered most. And across the room, she continued typing, unaware of the storm she had stirred in his mind. The war had changed her, but she had chosen to remain hidden. By the time the final operations of the campaign approached, the soldiers who had whispered her name in awe had moved on. New recruits arrived, eager and untested, unaware of the ghost, who had shaped battles in silence. Commanders planned attacks and retreats, relying on her abilities without ever acknowledging them. The army never documented her achievements publicly. On paper, she was still a clerk with neat handwriting and impeccable organization. But she knew the truth, and the truth was heavy. One crisp morning, she arrived at her desk, a folder already waiting with the latest orders. She did not hesitate. She opened it, scanning the lines of typed instructions. Another mission, another sniper assignment. The ghost was still needed. She felt the familiar tug of tension in her shoulders. The old fear, the old focus, surged through her. Yet this time, it was different. She had seen the cost to faces, the sleepless nights, the loneliness that never faded. She realized she could continue, but she also understood that legacy wasn't built through recognition or medals. Legacy was quiet. Legacy was survival. Legacy was invisible. So she accepted her assignments, not with pride, but with resolve. Her missions became surgical, precise. Entire enemy squads were neutralized with minimal exposure. Battles shifted before the opposition even realized what had occurred. Commanders praised results without knowing the architect. Soldiers survived without ever knowing the hand that had saved them. The ghost worked, moved, struck, and disappeared again. She carried her rifle with the same meticulous care as her typewriter, keeping both as symbols of the duality she had mastered. One allowed her to protect lives in the field. The other allowed her to exist in the office without fear, to maintain a semblance of normalcy, a fragile anchor to the person she once was. The colonel, who had finally seen her file, became a silent guardian of her secret. He understood that exposing her achievements could shift perceptions dangerously, inviting envy, political interference, or exploitation. So he kept the folder locked, returning her anonymity to its rightful place. He watched her work, saw the weight she carried in her eyes, and never spoke of it. There were moments when she thought about walking away, leaving the rifle behind for good. But the battlefield had shaped her in ways she could never forget. Every life she had saved was a reminder that she had a purpose beyond herself, a responsibility she could not abandon. And so she continued, quietly, steadfastly. Her legend grew in whispers. Soldiers shared stories around campfires of a sniper no one ever saw, a savior who could strike with impossibly perfect accuracy. They spoke of the ghost with reverence, not knowing her true identity. She walked among them, invisible, listening to their tales with a faint, private smile. No one suspected that the woman in glasses, shuffling papers, had orchestrated those victories from shadows. She learned to carry the isolation without bitterness. In silence, she found a strange freedom. The world could not know her, could not judge her. There were no expectations beyond her own, no applause to meet, no recognition to seek. She was free to act as needed, unburdened by the politics or pride of others. Even the faces of the fallen began to settle in her mind, as memories rather than hauntings. She remembered them not as numbers, but as moments, brief glimpses of humanity in the fog of war. Each kill had been necessary. Each had saved countless others. That knowledge became her compass, guiding her as surely as the stars had guided her father in the forests of her youth. One evening, after a long day, she returned to her small office space, her uniform soaked, her boots muddy. She sat down, the rifle first, cleaning it carefully, examining the scope, running her hands over the metal as if saying a private prayer. Then she picked up her typewriter. A contrast was stark. One instrument of death, one instrument of order. Both were necessary. Both defined who she was. She typed reports late into the night, documents that would never reach the public eye, operations that would never see medals or ceremony. But she typed them with precision and care, knowing that somewhere her work ensured the survival of countless lives. The colonel occasionally stopped by, silently observing. He never interfered, never questioned her methods. He only nodded once in quiet recognition of the extraordinary woman behind the unremarkable facade. And she never looked up, never acknowledged him beyond a brief tilt of her head. Their understanding was unspoken but complete. Years passed. The war ended. Soldiers returned home, bringing stories of battles fought and friends lost. Her unit disbanded, but she remained, quietly filing paperwork, organizing records, assisting with correspondence. On paper, nothing had changed. She was still the clerk. But the battlefield had left its mark in invisible ways, shaping her posture, her instincts, her mind. Her story never appeared in history books. There were no plaques, no parades, no public recognition. Only the secret files, locked away, and only occasionally referenced by those who understood their importance. And yet, in the quiet moments, she found satisfaction. She knew the truth, and that was enough. She had survived. She had saved lives. She had carried burdens that no one else could bear, and she had done it without fanfare. Her legacy, she realized, was not in fame or accolades. It was in the lives preserved, the missions accomplished, the battles turned quietly in the shadows. It was in the knowledge that one woman, underestimated and overlooked, could make a difference beyond measure. She sometimes returned in her mind to the farm, to the forests where she had first learned to hunt, to the girl who had once balanced a rifle on a fence post and dreamed of something larger. That girl had survived, had grown, had become more than she could ever have imagined. And she smiled softly at the memory, grateful for the roots that had shaped her, the solitude that had strengthened her, the silence that had defined her. Ghost remained. The clerk remained. Both existed simultaneously, each dependent on the other. She moved through the office as she had moved through battlefields, quietly, deliberately, unseen but ever present. And somewhere, in the minds of those who had survived because of her, the legend persisted. Soldiers told stories of the ghost. They spoke of precision, patience, and quiet heroism. They never knew her name. They never knew the woman behind the rifle and typewriter. But she didn't need them to know. She had always chosen silence. And in that silence, her legacy endured.